Now what the hell do you think you're doing with that tin star, boy?
Watch that boy shit, redneck. You talking to the sheriff of Rock Ridge.
There is a moment in Blazing Saddles that almost every fan has seen dozens of times, and almost none of them have truly understood. It happens quietly, without fanfare, without a punchline attached to it, and without any signal from the film that you are supposed to pay special attention. It is delivered by a man slouched in a jail cell bunk, barely holding his head up, speaking in a voice so low and so unhurried that you might mistake it for background noise. But is not background noise. It is arguably the most carefully constructed performance in the entire film. And for years, the man behind it said very little about what he was actually doing. Gene Wilder was not the kind of actor who held press conferences to explain his craft. He did not write lengthy memoirs dissecting his technique scene by scene. He gave interviews sparingly and spoke about his work with a kind of quiet modesty that sometimes made people underestimate what was happening beneath the surface. But in his later years, Wilder did begin to open up, and what he revealed about his time on Blazing Saddles fundamentally changes how you see the film. Not just his performance in it, but the entire structure of what Mel Brooks was trying to build and why it worked as brilliantly as it did. This is not a story about deleted scenes or behind-the-scenes gossip. This is a story about intention, about a performer who walked onto a chaotic set with a single, radical idea and quietly held the whole thing together with it. It is a story about what comedy actually requires and why the funniest thing Gene Wilder ever did in Blazing Saddles was decide not to be funny. To understand what Gene Wilder brought to Blazing Saddles, you first have to understand the circumstances under which he arrived. The production was not in good shape when Wilder got the call. Mel Brooks had already cast Gig Young, an established Hollywood actor with an Oscar to his name, in the role of the Waco Kid. Young was a credible choice on paper. He had the weathered dignity that the part called for, and his reputation lent a certain legitimacy to what was otherwise shaping up to be an extraordinarily unconventional film. But on the very first day of filming, everything fell apart. Young showed up on set visibly unwell. He was trembling, sweating, unable to hold his lines, and clearly not in a condition to perform. What some initially mistook for nerves, or perhaps an unusual approach to method acting, turned out to be something far more serious. Young was in the grip of acute alcohol withdrawal, and before the morning was over, he had collapsed. The production ground to a halt. Mel Brooks had a film with no lead actor for one of its central roles. Rather than go through the formal machinery of Hollywood casting, Brooks picked up the phone and called someone he trusted. Gene Wilder had worked with Brooks on The Producers years earlier, and their collaboration had produced something remarkable. Brooks knew what Wilder was capable of. He knew, more importantly, that Wilder understood what he was trying to do. The conversation was reportedly brief. Brooks explained the situation. Wilder said yes. He did not ask to see the script. He did not negotiate his rate. He did not request time to prepare. He simply agreed, packed a bag, and flew out the following day. That detail matters more than it might seem. The willingness to show up without preparation, without negotiation, without the protective scaffolding that most performers build around themselves before stepping in front of a camera, tells you something essential about how Gene Wilder approached his work. He did not need weeks to find the character. He needed something else entirely, and he had already found it before he landed. What Wilder revealed in later interviews about his arrival on the Blazing Saddles said is the part that most fans have never fully absorbed. Before he agreed to step into the role, before he even arrived on location, he told Mel Brooks one thing with complete clarity: he was not going to play the Waco Kid for laughs. In a film that was being constructed as one of the most aggressively comedic, satirically brutal, and gleefully offensive movies ever made, Gene Wilder's condition for joining the production was that his character would not participate in the comedy. Not directly. Not in the way that every other performer on screen was participating. The Waco Kid, as Wilder conceived him, would be a man who existed slightly outside the madness, who observed it with the tired eyes of someone who had seen too much to be surprised by anything anymore. Brooks agreed. And that agreement is the hidden architecture of everything that makes Blazing Saddles work as well as it does. Think about what the film is actually doing when it is firing on all cylinders. It is layering absurdity on top of absurdity, pushing its satire to the edge of what audiences could process, deliberately violating every expectation the Western genre had trained viewers to hold. Characters speak directly to the camera. The score wanders in from another movie. The fourth wall does not just break, it shatters and keeps shattering. In that environment, the temptation for every performer is to compete, to push harder, to escalate. Most of the cast did exactly that, brilliantly and intentionally. But without something to push against, escalation has no meaning. Without stillness somewhere in the frame, chaos is just noise. Wilder understood this at a level that went beyond instinct. He had studied enough about how comedy functions to know that contrast is not just a stylistic preference, it is a structural necessity. The Waco Kid needed to be the eye of the storm, and for that to work, he needed to resist every impulse that the material was generating in everyone around him. The jail cell scene is where this strategy becomes most visible, though visible is perhaps the wrong word because the whole point is that Wilder's method resists visibility. When Sheriff Bart first encounters the Waco Kid, the kid is introduced face down in a bunk, barely conscious, with the energy of a man who has made his peace with the world and found it wanting. Wilder plays the scene with almost no physical animation. His voice is flat, not in the way of a bored performer, but in the way of someone who genuinely no longer has the energy to perform for an audience. What Wilder later revealed about this scene is that the trembling hands, the detached delivery, and the quiet confession about his past were not played as comedy at all. He was playing them as real. The Waco Kid's shaking hands were not a comedic exaggeration of a drunk. They were, in Wilder's interpretation, the physical residue of genuine trauma. A man who had been the fastest gun in the West, who had built an identity around a skill that eventually became a burden, who had retreated into alcohol not for laughs, but because there was nothing left for him to care about. Wilder said in various interviews that he treated the character's alcoholism and his lost nerve as something genuinely sad, something he did not want to undercut with a wink. That choice transforms the scene. What could have been a setup for slapstick becomes something unexpectedly moving. And because it is moving, the comedy that surrounds it lands harder. When Wilder delivers a line with bone-dry precision in that context, it works not because he is being funny, but because we have momentarily forgotten we are watching a comedy. The humor sneaks up behind us while we are paying attention to something else. This is what Wilder meant when he later described his philosophy on the role. He was not trying to be the funniest person in the room. He was trying to be the most real person in the room. And in a film like Blazing Saddles, that turned out to be the funniest possible thing. No honest accounting of Blazing Saddles can ignore the shadow that Richard Pryor casts over the film, not just as a writer, but as the actor who was originally intended to play Sheriff Bart. Mel Brooks had fought hard for Pryor to have the role. He understood that Pryor's particular energy, his rawness, his ability to make an audience simultaneously uncomfortable and helpless with laughter, was essential to what the film was trying to say about race in America. Warner Brothers disagreed. Studio executives, citing Pryor's well-documented personal struggles and his reputation for unpredictability, refused to approve the casting. Cleavon Little ultimately took the role, and he gave a performance that is sharp, charming, and genuinely excellent. But the question of what Blazing Saddles would have been with Pryor in the lead is one that has fascinated film scholars and comedy historians for decades. Gene Wilder was one of the few people positioned to answer that question honestly, and in later years, he did reflect on it. Wilder and Pryor would eventually develop one of the great comedic partnerships in film history through Silver Streak and Stir Crazy. Their chemistry was built on a beautiful tension between Wilder's restraint and Pryor's explosive volatility. Wilder's stillness became even more potent when set against Pryor's unpredictability, and Pryor's energy found a kind of grounding in Wilder's calm. Had that pairing happened first in Blazing Saddles, the dynamic between the Waco Kid and Sheriff Bart might have been electrifying in a different way. Wilder's quiet sadness playing against Pryor's combustible energy might have created something even more emotionally complex. Wilder acknowledged this without resentment, noting that the chemistry he and Pryor eventually discovered felt like something that had been building since before they were in the same room. But here is what Wilder also understood. Even without Pryor on screen, Pryor was in the film. His voice was embedded in the writing, in the rhythm of the jokes, in the refusal to soften the racial commentary or protect the audience from what the satire was actually saying. Wilder credited Pryor's script contributions with giving the film its moral spine. The bravery on the page was Pryor's, even when someone else was delivering the lines. What Wilder eventually revealed went beyond his performance. He also disclosed the role he played off-screen in keeping the production from collapsing under the weight of its own ambition. Blazing Saddles was not a comfortable film to make. It was pushing against studio resistance, navigating genuinely controversial material, and being assembled at a pace that left little room for doubt or hesitation. Mel Brooks operated at a frequency of creative intensity that was inspiring, but also, for many on the cast and crew, exhausting. Wilder served as an informal stabilizing force during this period. not by directing scenes or overriding anyone's decisions, but by being consistently present and consistently calm. Between takes, he would talk with other performers, not in the grand manner of a senior actor dispensing wisdom, but in the practical way of someone who genuinely cared whether the scene was working and whether the people around him were all right. His experience from producers had taught him how Brooks operated, and he understood how to translate Brooks's vision to performers who were less familiar with his methods. What Wilder also disclosed, and this is the detail that most dramatically connects Blazing Saddles to the broader arc of film history, is that the concept for Young Frankenstein was developed in conversations with Brooks during the downtime of this production. Not in a formal pitch, not in a scheduled meeting, but in the random moments between takes when two creative minds found themselves with nothing to do but talk. Wilder had been carrying an idea about a descendant of Dr. Frankenstein desperate to escape his family legacy, and he shared it with Brooks on the Blazing Saddles set. Brooks initially dismissed it. Wilder, characteristically, did not push or argue. He went away and wrote a draft. When Brooks read it, he changed his mind immediately. The implication is extraordinary. Without the circumstances of Blazing Saddles, without the emergency that brought Wilder onto the set in the first place, without the downtime that the production's particular rhythm created, Young Frankenstein might never have existed. Two of the most beloved comedy films of the 20th century are, in ways that go beyond their obvious connection, products of the same creative crisis. One of the revelations that Wilder addressed in his more candid later interviews concerned the battles that were fought, mostly off-screen and behind closed doors, to preserve Blazing Saddles in the form that audiences eventually saw. Warner Brothers had significant reservations about the film's content. The racial language in the script, the directness of the satirical attacks on American mythology, and the film's absolute refusal to reassure its audience that everything was going to be fine were all subjects of studio memos and uncomfortable meetings. Brooks was the primary defender of the film's integrity, and that is appropriately documented. But Wilder's support during this period was more significant than has generally been acknowledged. He was not a producer. He had no formal authority over creative decisions. But he had credibility, earned through the producers and through his standing as a performer that the studio respected. When he backed Brooks's positions, it carried weight. Wilder's own later commentary on this makes clear that he saw the studio's discomfort not as a problem to be managed, but as evidence that the satire was working. He noted on more than one occasion that satire, which makes everyone comfortable, is not satire. Its entire function is to expose the things that institutions and social conventions prefer to leave unexposed. If Blazing Saddles made studio executives nervous, that was not a reason to change it. That was, in fact, the point. This perspective, quiet and principled and deeply uncomfortable for anyone who wanted the film to be something safer, is another expression of the same philosophy that shaped Wilder's performance. He was not interested in making the audience comfortable. He was interested in making them see something true, even if the vehicle for that truth was a movie in which someone punches a horse. Decades after Blazing Saddles first appeared, something interesting has happened to Gene Wilder's performance in it. The elements of the film that were loudest and most immediately striking when it was released have become familiar through repetition. The big jokes are well known. The most outrageous scenes have been quoted and referenced so many times that they have lost a degree of their original shock. But Wilder's work as the Waco Kid has not aged in the same way. If anything, it has become richer over time. This is the paradox of restraint in comedy. The broad performances, the escalating absurdity, the big moments, these are what you remember first. But what you return to, what reveals new layers on repeated viewing, is the quieter work. Wilder's hesitations, his pauses, his way of receiving information from other characters without immediately reacting to it, these are the details that reward attention. And because they reward attention, they create a kind of loyalty that louder performances cannot sustain in the same way. Wilder himself understood this about the work. He spoke about the importance of trusting the audience, of not over-explaining, of leaving space for the viewer to participate in what the performance was doing. The Waco Kid's emotional subtext, the sense of a man carrying a weight that the film never quite articulates directly, requires the audience to meet it halfway. And when they do, it sticks. The National Film Registry recognized Blazing Saddles as culturally, historically, and aesthetically